Welcome to the Makaranda Podcast. I am your host, Eleanor Evans Medina. This show is a space designed to share meditations, Dharma teachings, and conversations about life, death, and love. Thank you for listening, supporting, and sharing our work. Happy listening. Great. Let's start with 3 deep breaths, breathing in through the nose, out through the mouth, in through the nose, sit up nice and tall. Exhale, release. Last one, maybe we reach up on the inhale and let our arms go down by our side. Hello, beautiful Dr. Elise Sulser. Good. So glad to have you on the Makaranda Podcast.
So good to be here with you. Thank you so much for just being willing to have this conversation that I feel like doesn't get to be had very often or enough.
So we had a conversation in the car ride home after a beautiful solstice ceremony that our friends at Sparkleberry Lane put on in Denver just recently. And man, we just hit the ground running, didn't we?
Yeah, it was just like when you start to interweave and the conversation just gets better and better and better. And you're like, oh, I don't even want to leave. And we were like, we need to make a podcast about this. We need to get these thoughts, down and recorded and out to the world. And, just for us, I think it's like the beauty of weaving thoughts and minds in conversation.
So this is our very first intuition interview. And at first I thought, well, it was our conversation really about intuition? Like, does this make sense? And then you said, actually, it really does. So can you give our listeners a snapshot into what we were talking about to lay the foundation of our interview today?
Yeah, I mean, we were just diving in and riffing about all things death and numbing. And I think both of you and I are both doing work kind of around the intersection of grief and death and life, and kind of walking people through thresholds that are maybe uncomfortable and places that none of us have ever gone before. And I'll let you share a little bit later, kind of about the things that you've learned that happen in hospice care. But you pointed out that we are born into the world with our mothers being numbed in a way, epidurals, and then we leave the world in a way where the discomfort is removed from the scenario. And to tie that back into intuition, I was just having the thought, like, absolutely, this, ties back to intuition because it's almost like we've removed a piece of our lives that we actually know is so good for us, to be in the depth of the grappling. And when, whether it's antidepressants or whether it's pain meds, like when we numb the pain, either emotionally or physically, we miss out on so much spiritual richness and depth and composting that gets to happen to help us actually grapple with these massive shifts and these thresholds that we walk across in our lives, whether it's a big diagnosis or whether it's a loss of a loved one. And like, not to minimize the pain, and obviously we need help. Sometimes we need the ambulance, when there's moments, I tell my patients, like, antidepressants, like, if there is someone who is on the side of the road dying, or suicidality is, something that is being grappled with, we need the ambulance to like get through that chapter. And I don't think we have the conversation enough around, are we prolonging the numbing, or are we actually giving people tools to actually integrate and grow from the pain of the heartbreak of being human? And so the intuitive piece is, I think that there's actually a part of us that may miss and know that that is actually good for us, and part that will expand us into our full birthright of being human. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. you want to share a little bit about what you've kind of uncovered as far as being with hospice care patients? And I know you've kind of seen the inside of some of those chapters for people. And just share what you had been sharing with me that day.
It's exactly what you said, Dr. Elise. It is exactly the numbing and the running away from the pain, from the suffering. And when we actually do that, we create more of it. It seems
Mm-hmm.
counterintuitive almost,
So
but
counterintuitive.
I'm running from
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
It's
So that means I don't have to feel it. And then, 10 years later, maybe it catches up with us in the way
yes.
it shows up in our relationships or the way it shows up in us not necessarily being happy with, our life choices in a way because we never metabolized, we never composted that grief period of time, I think.
And when we are on our deathbed,
Mm-hmm.
like you were speaking about in the work that the gift that I'm able to do in this hospice work is pumped with morphine,
Mm-hmm.
drugs to run away from the pain. And look,
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean this in a judgmental way at all. It's more of a curiosity that's been sparked within me. Where are we running? And in our most pivotal moments of birth, where, like you mentioned, mothers are given sometimes epidurals, which has a form of fentanyl in it,
Mm-hmm.
which disassociates the mother from the body, which gives slight traces of that into the child that's being born. So we're born disassociated. So then, to me, as a traditionally trained marriage and family therapist, and I'm wondering what is happening with why people are running from their experience, looking to have altered experiences on a regular basis, which
Mm-hmm.
I think is also natural as human in some
Right.
ways too.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But that could be alcohol, that could be overexercise, it could be overeating or undereating, it could be sex, these addictions, social media, oh my
Mm-hmm.
gosh,
Mm-hmm.
so on and so
Right.
on. And then not to mention drugs themselves that are disassociating or that change our state. If we're coming into the world knowing that that's a part of the experience, then of course we're seeking that.
Right. Well, and it brings up the thought in me like we've almost labeled all pain and all discomfort as bad. Like, as an expecting mother or as somebody watching somebody else in pain, it's like this equal sign of like pain equals bad. Instead of being like, what if pain is actually part of the initiatory process? I mean, if you look in many indigenous cultures, like the becoming process of like teenagers or, you know, kind of warriorhood in a way, oftentimes the initiatory rites do incorporate some level of a painful process, whether it is marking the body or, wandering into the woods for 3 days with no food or water, fasting processes, some sort of physical level of discomfort. As far as now you get to walk across into this era of being a new being with more wisdom. And I've heard mothers who've expressed, that process of going through like this biggest transition of their lives, going from maidenhood essentially into motherhood. And I must wonder if the pain is like almost an integration tool, and not to celebrate pain or to like be like, oh my gosh, we all need to go, seek out, you know, out of body experiences in a way, but to approach it in a way that what if the pain actually was an integration tool? To not like hide it or equal it as bad, but being like this could actually be more of a shamanic experience in a way if we allow it in certain ways, or using like herbal medicines or herbal tools to kind of like soften it in the body, but not necessarily completely erase the experience. if that
Hmm.
makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, Dr. Elise, I'd love for you to share with us
Mm.
a bit about your background and
Mhm.
how you've trusted your intuition
Mm.
to bring you to where you are today.
Mm. Yeah, this is a big question. There's so many different layers to this. I mean, my background is as a naturopathic doctor. So I did the very traditional, I mean, it's alternative medicine, but it's still a traditional path of like you do the schooling and you go to graduate school and then you graduate and you get the degree. And through that process, I would say med school put me through the ringer in many ways. I tell people it's almost like the pressure cooker. You go to your absolute max and you add heat and you add pressure, and that's how diamonds are made in a way. And so during med school, I went through a very, very difficult relationship, COVID on top of it, plus the pressure cooker of med school. And, the story that I had created in that time was like, maybe I'm broken, that I cannot handle all of this. Um, and through that process, kind of like dismantling and really, really listening to like, what is that deep thing? Like getting really, really, really still with myself and saying, like, what is true here? What is not true here? And so through that process, my intuition was just kept on getting louder and louder. And that's kind of one of my pieces of my process with listening to intuition is like the longer I ignore it, the louder it gets over time. And so
Mhm.
that cycle, every time it comes around, the question is still there. And that I'm like, I'm starting to learn how to listen to that more. Whereas if I like try to push it under the rug and kind of let it go away and be like, no, I'm gonna muscle through, like make this happen, eventually I feel that disconnect with myself to the point where I'm like, oh, I don't actually recognize who I am anymore. And
Mhm.
so I didn't know if you have a question there.
Well, yeah. So many. When you
Yeah.
hear your intuition,
Mhm.
what does it sound like? What
Yeah.
do you hear it? Do you see it? Do you smell it?
It's it's more of a felt experience, um, of kind of an expansion or a heaviness. So when I choose to kind of override my intuition, it feels more of like a closing. Like my heart closes, my emotional body closes. And when I listen to it, even if it's terrifying, I feel this like almost like I'm on the mission of my life again. It's like this expansiveness. And so I just went through another kind of initiation this past year with career, where I was kind of doing the more traditional clinical job and then had a choice point to leave that job, to leave that thing that I've been training my whole life for, and to say, okay, let's say yes to the adventure of maybe being self created. And so entering into a death doula program. I've just completed a graduation certificate of looking into an integrative oncology. And so I'm stepping into this creatorship of actually creating like more intensive, integrative, like how do we do the soul work around cancer diagnoses, which is a story near and dear to my heart because my mom, I grew up with, or the first diagnosis came when I was about 13. And then since then, she's had 7 more diagnoses of cancer and has walked to the edge of life multiple, multiple times, which formed me deeply as a teenager, kind of watching this woman who was like, my pillar, my rock, my friend, and watching her again and again and again, kind of be on her knees, um, and be on that path with her, and then feeling how that has also shaped me in a way where it's like, oh, I want to go to those places with people. Like I want to be able to walk beside people in those places of actually saying, what does life mean to you? Like it's like a tap on the shoulder from life saying, like, whether you have 3 months or 10 years, like what actually matters. And she was somebody who I watched do it so well, where she was like, I hold my people so close and I'm not going to let this, stop me from living the life that I do have. And she's a miracle woman. Like she is healthy and thriving and here, but it's deeply informed kind of my work as I've walked away from just kind of general practice into like what actually feels like that intuitive core life work, more ceremony work, you know,
Hmm.
that asks people, a lot more people who are ready, to venture there. But for the people who I find that are like really, really thirsty to be seen in that space. And it's not something that's offered by conventional care very often at all, or having hard conversations about what are the options, or what if, it's stage 4 and death is inevitable, but now what? What do we do with this, quote unquote gray zone, which is not gray at all. It's actually so full of color and so full to be mined for gold and richness and connection. So yeah, that's been kind of the winding of my path up to date.
So traditional Western schooling
Mm-hmm.
to working in a job that wasn't fulfilling
Mm-hmm.
in,
Exactly.
in the ways that your intuition was sharing with you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you take us back to that moment of,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I'm doing the things, I'm in school and I'm following the path, and then what was your body and soul speaking? How were you knowing
Yeah.
like you needed to go towards this grief and
Mm-hmm.
cancer diagnosis work?
Right. I mean, it's been a bit of a process. I think the first time was actually in med school, and it was post a week after an ayahuasca ceremony. The first time I had met grandmother and sat with grandmother, and I had a very deep crash afterwards where
Mm.
she just brought up everything for me to look at. And it was like everything in my body, being able to see the world and like the trajectory that I was going on, and feeling how like life sucking it is to do transactional care and medicine, and to like go into a system that I was like, oh my gosh, this is not actually life giving. So I almost dropped out of med school with 15 weeks to go. Um, Thanks,
Wow.
grandmother, ayahuasca. And I dug my nails in and I was like, no, I've come this far. I'm going to finish. And so I slogged it out. I finished, took my board exams, it showed up a lot as like emotional um, density, I would say. So, like bouts of depression through med school, where that was my intuition and my physical body saying, like, no, no, we can't do this.
Mm.
Um,
Okay, I'm going to
and
stop you there
then,
for just a
yeah,
second
mm-hmm,
because I think this is important for our
yeah,
listeners. This piece
mm-hmm,
around your body, the body wisdom
mm-hmm.
that you're speaking
Oof,
to. Can you break
yeah.
that down for us?
Yeah. I mean, the body, oh, I love this topic because our body is our compass, our tool, and she's always speaking, always speaking in symptoms, or
Right.
our energy or physical pain. Like I had chronic shoulder pain, just one example through school. And she was just saying, like, hey, I cannot sit for this long and carry. It was like the weight, like physically manifesting as like pain. And thank God for good chiropractors who can unwind that. But it was also tied with like the emotional shedding of like what no longer is actually feeding me, no longer actually supporting me. So I think that all things start on kind of like whether it's chronic disease or emotional or physical, kind of starts on this disconnection from self. I mean, you could even go into cancer, like disconnection from that identity. Like, where do we reject ourselves? Where do we say, oh, I'm not worthy of choosing that life? I'm not worthy of, leaving this abusive partner to choose a life that really lights me on fire. And that our cells are listening to, even on just like a minute level, microscopic level. But then it like by the time a full blown disease process is manifest in the body, it's maybe 10 years down the line. Um, and there's amazing things that we can do nutritionally, supplementally, all of those things. But if it's not necessarily paired with that kind of like unwinding, that belief that like got us here, we can have a whole stack of supplements. It's not going to do anything. And I've seen that. And that was kind of one of the walls I hit in my clinical practice. Was it's like, wait a minute, there's actually so much more here. So that's where your work as, like deeply uncovering and helping people walk through that like internal belief system is like so profound. And especially when paired with like, yes, this is our vessel. I named my company Vessel Wellness because this is like how we transmit our love. And if we don't caretake our vessel, then we're not going to actually feel well. But it's like both and bi-directional always. So yeah, I love that question about the
Mm-hmm.
physical body. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm listening to Dr. Joe Dispenza again. I'm revisiting his work, of which
Mm-hmm.
is
Such good work.
so powerful. And he explains that the body is simply the soul manifest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anything that's
Yeah.
happening within our bodies is actually happening to us as beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're
Exactly.
not our bodies,
Mm-hmm.
right? From a spiritual level, I am not my body.
Right.
My body
Mm-hmm.
can be unable to move, but
Mm-hmm.
I still exist.
Mm-hmm.
The heart,
Right.
the soul of me still exists.
Right. Right.
And instead of, as clinicians for us, instead of looking at what's broken in the body, we know that actually chi, energy, only gets stuck
Mm-hmm.
when it's not moving,
Yeah.
when there isn't
Mm-hmm.
energy going and shifting in and throughout
Mm-hmm.
the body. And if
Mm-hmm.
we can listen
Right.
to that tight shoulder, if we
Right. Like,
can
what is she
listen,
saying? What is
mm,
speaking coming from here? And it's not always the first thing we think, but sometimes it's residual emotional trauma that's like, hey, like, I need some attention, some love, some change of some kind.
and instead of
Mm-hmm.
going to being angry at our bodies,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
can
Which is
we
so
say,
easy. Yeah.
it is, especially if that's what we're taught.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, if we can say, wow, thank you, body, for protecting me. Thank you, body, for what your wisdom is sharing with me.
Right.
What do you need from me? I remember when I was first learning about psychedelic medicine work and I was in an internship kind of, it was like a underground
Uh-huh.
apprenticeship with a teacher. We were working, and I remember it was my own ceremony that I was doing with this guide, and my knee came to life. And I had had knee issues from high school on. And this was in 2018 when my knee came to life, and my knee literally spoke to me. I was stretching in the
Oh.
ceremony, and my knee was like, Eleanor, you have been so mean to me. You're
Yeah.
speaking down to
Wow.
me. You're running, even though I'm screaming out that it doesn't feel good. I'm trying to give you every warning sign that I don't like this, but you do it
Mm-hmm.
anyway. Like, please stop. I'm trying, like, what else do you need me to do? And I literally burst into tears. And, with my heart wide open, with the support of the space and the medicine, I was like, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry I
Yeah.
wasn't listening. I promise I will listen from now on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that kind of brings me back to like the pain piece that we were talking at the beginning, like our ignoring or discomfort. So it can kind of go one in two ways where we run by numbing or we run by dissociating and not listening. But so many of the people who I know who have chosen to take on their pain as almost like a shamanic initiation, it's been so beautiful to watch, where it's almost like the pain has been handed to them as a teacher to say, hey, can you go deep into your own suffering and learn how to listen? I mean, kind of how you're sharing the story, or I have another dear friend who's walked through Lyme and chronic fatigue, and she has just walked through chapters of being exhausted. cannot function. And she's an artist and a musician. And she has walked out of this chapter with a deep, deep listening of like, oh, this is how I caretake my body. Listen to her and give her rest. And it's been this like impulsive, like this creation that's come out of her of like such deep soul medicine music, and listening to her sing and create. And then like the richness would not have been there had she not listened deeply to the pain. And ceremony work, a lot of ceremony work in there too. And I think the plant medicines are helpful. They're not necessary for the listening, but kind of like your experience where you're just like, whoa, you are speaking in a language. And I actually can go in, down, in, through the pain and up with wisdom on the other side.
Right.
And I wish more, you know, teenagers in a way had access to mentors who would encourage, space and witnessing rather than, oh, it's like, ignore you or put you on an antidepressant or something's wrong with you, labeling it as broken when it's not. And same with emotional pain. I mean, I think there's a really beautiful TED talk out there on more indigenous cultures and people who've walked through psychotic breaks, and the outcome in the US, where we kind of pathologize and medicalize that and put people on medications, is very, very different than in these groups of people who they're paired with like a mentor who maybe has done the same thing and they're honored and revered, saying, oh, this psychological thing that you're walking through actually means that you're really close to the spirit realm. And the outcome is completely different. So, yeah, both the emotional, the physical, that intuitive piece of like listening, listening again. When we're almost like numbing our intuition,
Right.
kind of going back to that place, numbing our intuition by numbing our pain.
Right.
Instead of being like, how sensitive can I get? And can I actually listen and make the changes instead of ignoring it again? Easier said than done. I
And
will say easier said than done there.
and I mean, I think the easier said we're done, easier said than done it's just because we don't practice it,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not a habit yet. But once we start making it a habit, because when we're numbing our pain, we also, as Brene Brown talks about so beautifully in her work, we're also numbing the joy and the happiness and the bliss and
Mm-hmm.
the expansion and being able to live in that place
Right.
at all
Right.
times. Even in the challenge and the discomfort, can we love it and say thank you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it takes as long as it takes. I think we're kind of a Hollywood obsessed culture as well, with like, oh, but I just want the happy ending. I want it now. And one of my other teachers, she reminded me through the winter, like, a rose blooms when it's ready. Cause I was just kind of in the deep pain of like, I don't know where my life spark is anymore. And then finally the thing started to shed and I like made some really pivotal decisions. And then I was like, all of a sudden life came back online again. But it was like after 6 months of just like, I don't know what's lighting me up. And this like emotional pain it just felt like there was a cap on kind of, my life and the direction because I wasn't necessarily ready to like choose the intuitive piece, it takes this incubation period
Right.
where just like all the systems catch up gracefully, gently. It can't be forced. But I think having support along the way, it's like the work you do or ceremony work or having hospice care that tells people like it's okay to grieve and it's okay to be angry and in this like gray zone of pre-death and allowing things to die. And if we had more structures, I just wonder if we would be more like have more capacity to hold both the hard and the joy and like that full spectrum expansive, everything. But we don't really have support systems for that or like a template to say, hey, I've walked that before. And so that's why I really like love having people who have like seeking out mentors, seeking out teachers who've walked that path, who are
And I
willing to
think,
share wisdom.
Elise, I think we used to have that. We
Mm-hmm.
used to
Yeah.
have it more so,
Mm-hmm.
especially in spiritual traditions, where
Right.
actually we don't, in my view, have to figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to know the how it's going to work. but we can actually give up this to the higher infinite intelligence
Yeah, absolutely.
and be asked to be guided and directed. And I think we're going as, people, I was born in 1990. When were you born?
93.
So we're in the millennial
Hmm.
demographic. And we, I think, kind of got the short end of the stick around this whole God thing.
Mm.
Because,
Wow, I hadn't thought of it that way.
oh my gosh, it's like we, at least I could speak for myself, I didn't connect with the way that God was being portrayed to me in
Mm.
Catholicism, in how I was raised. And my parents did, I think, a really great job of supporting me in being curious about spirituality.
Wow, that's so rare.
So rare. I'm super grateful for that. You know,
Hmm.
I've always questioned religion, but I've always trusted that there's some divine intelligence, not
Yeah.
not a God up in the sky telling me that, talking about good and bad or right and wrong, this very
Right.
dualistic thinking that never resonated with me even as a young child. And so I think part of what my work as a spiritual coach and facilitator and relationship expert, um, and medicine woman is to allow for people to come back to this deep trust in the divine.
Absolutely. I love how you say that. Yeah, I grew up deeply in the evangelical church. And I always felt a little bit like, well, I was bought in for some time, but I always felt like, there's something here that feels so judgmental overtly. And it wasn't that anybody publicly shamed me or anything, but there was like this internalized message of always being wrong. And so then I walked away from it for many, many years, being like, well, that's not it. So I'm going to go into the social justice world and be a good human and, find my own way. But there was always this piece that was like, oh, but there's so much beauty in this intelligence, divine, that I could never shake. And even the Christ story. And recently, even just in the last like month, I've been diving into kind of the Gnostic Gospels, the forbidden, the things that were cut out of the Bible, and diving into like the Magdalene scriptures. And it's been life changing, revolutionary, where it was like this intuitive knowing that I was like, why wouldn't there be some sort of romantic love or this like beauty between the masculine and the feminine within ourselves, this own knowing of like who God is in every single human, not this outsourcing or this pedestalizing, this more circular knowledge that was completely cut out from most of the scriptures. And so I've been on my own journey of like, oh, my little like teenage intuitive self knew something was up there, but didn't have the language or the words. And so then through, medicine work and through my own journey and through finding other, other beliefs to kind of pull from, I've come back full circle to like integrating a lot of those to still being like, oh, whoa, maybe there is some part that was true there, but I've reinterpreted and reimagined in a way that feels so much more whole, so much more like true in like my being. And now I can actually celebrate, a lot of that story. um, but I just celebrate our young people who just was like, no, I have this knowing and I'm gonna go on a search for that knowing. And it's gonna find me.
Mhm.
And I just find that really beautiful. That
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be like either or and completely walking away from like all forms of spirituality. Or
Gosh,
stealing from
opposite.
other or taking from other cultures. Like there's something that's just like inborn in us, like innate in us, that's like, no, I know that there is something so divine and I can connect to it at any moment, whether it's in the deep pit of despair and grief and like making meaning out of that, or in the highest celebrations. um
Yes.
yeah.
Thank you. For
um,
our listeners, what is the one piece of advice that you have to support them in coming back to their intuition?
Hmm. Wow. It's going to be a little bit different for everyone, but the process that I have started to get back in touch with is really turning everything else off. I think I used to consult with all my friends and let me call my mom and how do I make this decision and that like spiral. And I think recently when I've caught the spiral starting and the answer is not coming through, I'm like, okay, get off of my phone, stop reaching for something outside of myself, and I'll just plop myself down with my cup of tea. Tea ceremony and meditation is one of my main forms of like returning to self. And I'm very, very lucky and privileged and blessed to live out in the woods on the side of a mountain. And I'll just go out and sit with nature and just be like turn my brain off and just get still as I possibly can for as long as I can. Let the tears come, let the thing wash through. And whatever the little quiet, the most peaceful piece that comes through, that is most likely the voice that is my intuition. And sometimes it takes a few times, but ultimately it's getting quiet and
A
getting still.
peaceful voice.
It's like the most peaceful thing that's like, oh, okay. Even if it's hard, even if it might mean a lot of change, but it's like the thing that feels like the most, okay, like that exhale to my body. And again, back to that body wisdom.
Right. And quieting the
Oh,
mind wisdom. Right?
exactly.
And you're saying, it's going to be different for everyone, perhaps, but it's not the loud, sharp voice necessarily that actually could be the inner critic
hmm It's not the
speaking up.
shoulds, it's not the fears, it's not the like, shaking your finger like, oh my goodness, this is, you're being naughty. It's like actually the most loving piece that wants to come through.
The
Like what,
most
which is
loving.
hard to sift through sometimes. There's a lot of
Well,
layers. Sometimes it's hard
again,
to sift through that voice, but
Elise, here we go.
muscle. It's a muscle. Yeah, that we're working. Because I never,
That's
I
it.
never really resonated with typical meditation. Just shut off your mind and sit there and meditate on a rock or listen to a guided one. It's been, my plant teacher of tea that's actually been such a subtle, like actually allowing me to quiet. So I think some people do love, the movement meditations or yoga or, a guided meditation. For me, it's been a profound practice of the several years of a tea practice. Just kind of that gentle guiding back to like, let's untie this knot just gently, give it a little space to breathe. And then you're like, okay, I can do this. The next right thing, just the
Mm,
next thing. And it's sometimes the most simple thing. It's the thing that's not trying anymore.
mm,
Mm-hmm.
mm. I love this advice. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. Thank you for walking with me in this beautiful conversation.
such a gift. Thank you,
Hmm.
Eleanor.
Truly. And how can people find you? What's the best
Yeah,
way for our friends to get in touch with you to follow up?
absolutely. Um, Best way I'm on Instagram. So Dr. Elise Sulser, ND, is on Instagram or my website, drelisesulsernd.com as well. And then, yeah, I'm offering one-on-one work, moving more into this oncology cancer doula program. So supporting all of the pieces of the physical terrain and how did we get to the place of a cancer diagnosis and seeing what individualized, bio responses are happening in the body and walking those backwards, unwinding those with the emotional, spiritual support in your corner. So that's one of my main offerings. And then this fall, I'll also be teaching a course on kind of body wisdom, along with a dear, dear friend and therapist. So if people want to follow along with that journey, that would be amazing and epic. It's going to be so good. Um,
And
yeah.
this will be fall of 2024.
Yes, fall of 2024. So
Okay,
coming
great.
up. Yeah.
Great.
Thank you so much. This has been
Thank you so
such a
much.
beautiful unfolding.
We could keep going and going and
I
going.
know.
And
Absolutely.
I feel that this is a beautiful introduction to listening to, as my mother calls, growing up, my mother would say, it's the wise woman on your shoulder who's speaking,
Mm.
and that's your intuition.
Oh, interesting.
And so
Yeah.
this is an invitation for all of us to practice listening to our wise woman, listening to the soft, kind, loving voice to take us into the highs and the lows
hmm And the lows. Yeah.
of
And one
of
of my
this life.
it's like this whole thing. The whole life is our ceremony. But as one of my dear friends says, they're like, you can't force people into their evolution. You can only love them into their healing. And I think that applies to ourselves too. I just love how beautiful that phrase is, where it's like we can't force ourselves or beat ourselves up into a change process. But the more we can just be like that gentle, loving, wise woman, like the evolution will just happen. And that
Yeah.
wise woman doesn't always just let us like sit in a ball forever in corner,
Uh-uh.
crying on the floor. Sometimes she's like, hey, get up, take a shower, and go do your purpose in the world. And that's love. But
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, I love this.
Thank
Yay.
you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
This has been the Makaranda Podcast with your host, me, Eleanor Medina. This show is a space dedicated to sharing meditations, Dharma teachings, and conversations about life, death, joy, grief, wisdom, compassion, love, and what really matters to us. Thank you so much for listening and for supporting our podcast. Thank you, dear friends, so much for listening, for being a part of the Makaranda community. As a beekeeper and a woman of the earth, I'm learning so much about nature every single day. And the bees themselves, Makaranda, the nectar, Makaranda means nectar in Sanskrit, and the nectar is always keeping us on our toes. I am constantly learning from nature and recently had my queen bee actually fly away from the hive, and every beekeeper that I talked to was like, no, that didn't happen. And yet it did. It did happen. And there's this deep sense of trusting ourselves and this ability to say, I saw that. I know what I saw. And people who are quote unquote experts might try to talk us out of it. But, in this podcast, my hope is for you to really trust who you are and to trust nature and to be in this great mystery, this inquiry of life, and to keep showing up, tuning into our podcast so you can keep diving into the mysteries with us. We're so grateful and looking forward to seeing you with our next guest or our next meditation here at the Makaranda Podcast soon. Thank you. See you next time.